Well, the U.S. House of Representatives just passed a budget resolution that offers a lot of insight into Trump's priorities for this one big, beautiful bill that is coming down the pipeline. Now, it still has to pass the Senate, but this does give us a lot to think about in terms of what that final plan might look like, and more importantly, how it's going to impact all of us. And I have some thoughts on that, but I want to walk through what this resolution actually says because there seems to be a lot of misconceptions out there being spewed by all sides. So first and foremost, this was a budget resolution. It's not a bill. No tax bill has been passed. In fact, no law at all has been passed. This is just a fiscal blueprint that guides future legislation. And that is a critical piece of the puzzle in getting tax cuts through before they expire at the end of this year. But no tax law has been passed yet. There was this viral TikTok video talking about how Trump betrayed his base because it had no mention of no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security. He lied. And it really is extremely misleading and really irrelevant because it's not a tax bill. It's a budget resolution. On the other side of the aisle, you have people criticizing Democrats because they voted against the working man. They voted no on no tax on tips, which is just not true. That's not what this is. So let's talk about what was actually covered in the budget resolution and what it's going to mean for all of us in the future. So number one, it calls for at least $1.5 trillion in spending cuts over the next 10 years. And that includes $880 billion in cuts to programs under the Energy and Commerce Committee's jurisdiction, which does impact Medicaid and a lot of public health programs, and I'm going to come back to that. $330 billion in cuts for the Education and Workforce Committee, $230 billion in cuts for the Agriculture Committee, which does include SNAP benefits, farm subsidies, things like that, $50 billion for Oversight and Government Reform Committee, $10 billion for the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, $1 billion for the Financial Services Committee, and $1 billion for the Natural Resources Committee. All of that totals $1.5 trillion. However, to fully unlock the planned $4.5 trillion in tax cuts also mentioned, spending cuts need to be $2 trillion. So $1.5 trillion is like the minimum target, but $2 trillion is the ideal because if lawmakers fall short of that $2 trillion goal, they're going to have to reduce the amount of tax cuts by the same amount. On the other hand, if they exceed $2 trillion in spending cuts, they may have room for even more tax cuts. That's a lot to cut. And to quickly just go back to the Medicaid spending cut, there's been a lot of headlines indicating that $880 billion is getting cut from Medicaid. Medicaid only makes up a portion of the programs overseen by the Energy and Commerce Committee. Granted, it's the biggest program with that, so very likely that cuts will come from Medicaid. And to put that $880 billion in perspective, remember that's over 10 years, Medicaid spending was $618 billion in 2024. So if the entire $880 billion in spending cuts were all taken from Medicaid, that would be $88 billion per year for the next 10 years, which is about a 14% cut in Medicaid spending. Now, if the money was taken pro rata from other programs under the Energy and Commerce Committee, like energy, environment, other health programs like NIH, it would be about a 6.7% reduction in Medicaid spending. Either way, it's likely a big chunk is going to come from Medicaid. We just don't know what those cuts look like until we see a bill. The budget resolution itself does not have the power to change spending. It only sets targets for future legislation. So let's get back to the budget resolution. As I said, we have that $1.5 trillion in proposed spending cuts at a minimum, but they also added a $300 billion increase in some other committees, like the Judiciary, Armed Services, Homeland Security, so defense and security stuff. And then, of course, we have that $4.5 trillion decrease in tax cuts over the next 10 years. Now, the resolution doesn't specify which tax proposals will be extended or added, only that is the total target size of the tax cuts, which interestingly is not enough to get all of Trump's tax cuts through. Now, projecting the impact of tax policy is very difficult, but it's projected that the cost of extending the current tax rates another 10 years would cost between $3.9 and $4.8 trillion. That's not lowering our current tax rates. That's just preventing them from going back up to what they were pre-2018, which is 3 to 4% higher for most people. So that $4.5 trillion is right in the middle there. Adding in all the other proposals like no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, all that's estimated to cost between $5 and $11 trillion. So I expect that these new tax proposals will be designed in some way to limit who qualifies for them so that they can make it work from a budget perspective. So let's do some math. You got $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, $1.5 to $2 trillion in spending cuts. So even if they manage to cut $2 trillion in spending, you still have a $2.5 trillion deficit over the next 10 years. So what do we do with that? More debt, of course. So the resolution includes a $4 trillion increase in the national debt limit over the next 10 years. And that's what makes up for the shortfall. But lifting that debt limit by $4 trillion is really just what is needed to get this next wave of tax cuts through. It doesn't deal with the longer term debt issue. They actually show in here the projected national debt by 2034, and it's pretty terrifying. is we're continuing to run bigger and bigger deficits. Congress keeps approving that deficit spending, and the interest on the debt continues to compound, an amount at which, by the way, is almost as much as our defense budget. I think it's projected that the interest alone on our debt is soon to exceed $1 trillion per year. That's crazy, and it's unsustainable. So what does that mean for us? Well, I think it's important to remember that if you have tax cuts without a decrease in spending, it's not really a tax cut because you're going to pay for it in the form of inflation. Whatever the government spends in a given year, we pay for it 100%, whether that be in the form of taxes or inflation, or in our case, both. So I think the best way to deal with this from a personal finance perspective is to build a plan that can withstand short-term inflation as well as long-term inflation. I know that's a lot easier said than done. A couple ways to go about it is just getting in the habit of spending less than you make, getting your money invested in diverse appreciating assets, and then making sure that your long-term savings and retirement plan doesn't underestimate inflation. It may not look like how it has, that 2 to 3% over the past several decades. I mean, I hope it does. Hope it's less than that. But if you can maybe do some stress testing with your retirement projections to see what would happen in the event that we were to have long-term sustained inflation, that can offer a little bit of comfort knowing that you still have a plan if that ends up happening. Now, as far as the tax cuts, I'll dive into it when we get more details, but it seems like they're making the extension of the Trump tax cuts a priority, which I've done several videos on already, but I'll keep doing updates as we learn more.